This week's lecture, we're going to be discussing our wild animal portraits assignment. Okay. Remember, throughout this lecture, we'll look at some artist local references, as well as talk a little bit about how a few sort of approaches and strategies you can sort of tackle and experiment with when we're using our Prismacolor pencils throughout this assignment. Again, remember, all of this will be available under the modules tab. So if you do need any more context, that should be uploaded online, as well as on the website, which we'll go over a little bit today. So using primary, secondary, and tertiary colors, students will explore the variety of tonal variations when experimenting with Prismacolor pencils. Okay. We're going to explore the fundamental elements of color theory using highlights and shadows when observing our wild animals to create portrait drawings. Investigating jungles and rainforests in Amazonian regions of South America, to sub-Saharan deserts in Africa, and tropical forests in Asia, just to name a few. We'll start to see as well as not only old masters, but students' work throughout these lectures to kind of get your guys' ideas and gears running to kind of show a variety of diverse ranges of how some of these animals are depicted, as well as in terms of laid out throughout their composition. Here's a wonderful example of a student using 2 crows for their actual drawing assignment. And it's interesting, again, the more and more you analyze and start to focus from a student's perspective of understanding color combinations, but also sort of color theory in general, really part of this process would be to really explore all aspects of our Prismacolors and not just one, right? This is really important to when we understand the sort of ways in which we can look and research certain references for our actual portraits, okay? And you'll start to see a variety of not just portraits, but the actual entire body of the animal, which is completely optional. So I'll keep that in mind. Here's another example of a student's work. So in terms of our learning objectives, remember, wild animals must be clear representations from the reference photograph, excuse me. Okay, they must be clear images. Okay, we are trying to work with the natural world, but really the image itself should not be as abstract as we started off throughout this quarter. Okay, part of this is sort of to, again, use our Prismacolors to layer each color on the tone Canson paper in order to create highlights and shadows. Okay, we are not working with our Strathmore paper. Okay, grading criteria will be within the accuracy and the highlights and shadows when using color composition, showing unique creativity and overall craftsmanship. Now, for the assignment itself, we're using a 19 by 25 inch tone drawing paper only. It's the brand itself. It's called Canson. Okay, it is a black sheet of paper, and you should have 2 available in your supply kits if you purchase your supplies from the supply list. Okay. Now, we do have a set of 12 or 24 sets of Prismacolors. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, we should have the 12, but we also can use our 24, okay? I've condensed the list, the supply list, just to kind of be more mindful of cost, because I know the Prismacolors can be really expensive. But if you are able to get your 24 sets, great. The more the merrier, okay? You don't need your like 64 and 36 sets. 24 is more than enough. We are also using our white eraser and sharpener. Those are also very key, important tools throughout this assignment. Yes, you can erase in the beginning stages throughout this assignment, okay? And then lastly, we have a Prismacolor blending pencil, which is completely optional. I will go over that in the demo. Sort of a nude color that really blends beautifully with some tonal variations, whether if it's working with scales, fur, feathers, any sort of texture, to be honest, to kind of have a sort of really nice blended effect with the Prismacolors. Okay. Now remember, the Prismacolors are oil-based, meaning they can blend beautifully within layers and layers. Okay. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into the demo. Now again, throughout time, throughout history, and throughout mankind, you'll start to see this really interesting pattern of how looking at the history of human beings as a species is really clearly documenting their observations to the natural world. Whether if it's looking at Paleolithic periods of Lascaux caves, which are in the regions of southern France and northern Spain, of cave paintings, in relationship to hieroglyphs from ancient Egypt. And this is also really interesting, sort of thinking about the ways in which animals represent not only their physical form, but their spiritual or the more sort of manifesting symbol of how they are recognized in the culture, in said culture, right? You'll start to see an interesting pattern of really recognizing how human beings, created through observation from the natural world, how they had their everyday mundane lives be documented throughout time and throughout space. But they also had a more symbolical meaning. Lama Su, which is a human-headed winged lion during the ancient Neo-Assyrian period in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, is a great example of this. This is an image captured in the Museum of the Louvre in Paris, which have two large, huge monolithic sculptures of Lama Su in front of the Ishkar gates of King Nebuchadnezzar II in Mesopotamia, embodying a god king, the power of those rulers at that time of Nebuchadnezzar II, but also sort of thinking about how in which, when you stand in front of the actual sculpture itself, it almost seems extremely intimidating and powerful, right? The more forward position of the sculpture. But when you come around it, it's interesting too. You can see the feet are moving away from you. And you can start to see an interesting relationship between counting the number of legs on the sculpture itself, which is interesting because it's 5, 2 in the front and then 4 on the side. That really interesting optical illusion is also, again, consider the fact that sort of looking at the ways in which this hybrid of god-like king, as well as a beast or of an animal, represents a sort of a symbol of power in terms of old antiquity. But similarly, obviously, it's represented through the contrasting lights and shadows from two-dimensional works of art as well, right? Caravaggio, who is, again, a Baroque master genius of lights and darks, really is a great reference to look at when you're thinking about less can mean more in terms of shadows. This is something I also want you guys to sort of recognize when you're sort of analyzing your actual animal itself, right? How can you use your tone sheet of paper to sort of, again, have some mystery in the background and really exaggerate your lights and darks? And that's completely, obviously, optional to sort of think about, but I also want you to sort of exaggerate that sort of highly contrast in the entire pictorial space. Jacques-Louis David's painting of Napoleon, similarly in comparison, juxtaposed to Candy Wiley's painting of Napoleon, leading in the army over the Alps, right, is a sort of really interesting play between power of the sort of white male figure in relationship to the black male figure. Candy Wiley is a contemporary African-American artist who deals with the white and male sort of lens in the context of sort of looking at history genre paintings, but also substitutes his characters and his models for black figures, a play on power, a play on the sort of the social economic roles that we live in terms of contemporary society, or contemporary issues, I should say. Obviously, this has a interesting relationship to sort of masculine power, but also sort of the roles in which not only the decorative arts comes into play in terms of the background of Candy Wiley's painting, but David is sort of showcasing Napoleon and the more sort of political propaganda crossing through the Alps, right? It's a really interesting play between power. Peter Stewart is a really interesting artist from South Africa who also uses the roles in which the sort of the highly contrasted dark shadows of his backgrounds really push the subject forward in contrast of lights and darks, right? It's a really interesting example of looking at his work, but also sort of looking at the ways in which artists are using animals in a contemporary way. Dominique Salome, who's also another artist from South Africa, also uses the ways in which color, as well as color theory and watercolor, can also sort of bring in another avenue of, again, really dissecting and kind of eliminating parts of the animal to highlight other parts, mainly in their portraits itself. Walton Ford, who's an American contemporary painter, really deals with a variety of mixed medias, mainly with watercolors and gouache, but also works with acrylics, oils, and Prismacolors and markers, but has a sense of sort of really maximalistic point of view of large scale paintings, mainly dealing with a sense of humor, but also a sense of irony and a sense of sort of a bit of satire. Another really great example of sort of looking at his work in the context of how he really highlights how animals can be represented in a more sort of, again, humoristic point of view. There's a really great Art 21 documentary video that I highly recommend. Again, those links are going to be provided on the lecture. Feel free, if you're interested, I would highly actually recommend watching those videos. I believe they're only about like 11 to 12 minutes long, so not that long, and they're all free. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about color mixing and blending. Okay. Now, this is a color wheel that I like to use throughout all of my studio courses, is sort of, again, laying down a foundation of understanding how color really works. In the most basic form, 3 primaries in the center of this triangle are all of the colors that you can really mix to make any other color. Okay. And also, primaries cannot be mixed in order to create that said color. So you cannot mix any other color to make a red. You cannot mix any other color to make a yellow, and then so on and so forth with the blue. Okay. But if you mix them all 3 together, you create a brown, right? A nice neutral brown. Now, again, in the more sort of basic terminology, a primary color within this color wheel, okay, is your red, your yellows, and blues. A secondary color would be considered 2 primaries that make a secondary color. So you mix red and yellow, you get a secondary color, which is what? Orange, right? You get yellow and blue, mix that together, you get green. And finally, from red to blue, you get your purple or violet, okay? So pretty self-explanatory. Now, this is where things get interesting. What is a tertiary color? It is really created by mixing a primary and secondary color, okay? For example, a primary red to a secondary orange will create a tertiary orange-red, right? Same thing here, to the opposite. A primary red to a secondary violet or purple will make a red or violet or purple, and then so on and so forth, right? Pretty self-explanatory. Now, this is something I also want you to also consider. Complementary colors or analogous color palettes. Okay. What is a complementary? What is a complementary color of red, which is exactly on the opposite of the color wheel? Green. What is a complementary color of yellow, which exactly is on the opposite side of the color wheel? Purple, violet. What's a complementary color of the orange? Exactly on the opposite side would be a blue. Those colors really work well in terms of color harmony and balance. If you darken a red, you would add a secondary color. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the demo. Now, analogous color combinations are those colors located close together on the color wheel. So what does that mean? You could use a yellow, yellow-green, green, a blue-green, usually around 4 colors. What's another color combination of analogous color palettes? Orange, yellow, orange, red, 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 violet, violet, right? And then, or purple, excuse me, and then so on and so forth. Now, if you look at it more carefully, you could use those analogous color combinations to really exaggerate and, again, push those values to lights and darks. Talk a little bit more about that in the demo. This is a list of the Prismacolors available on the 24 sets, so keep this in mind. So we'll talk a little bit more about these in the demonstration specifically, but this is sort of some of the color variations that you can use. Now, remember, you don't have to get your 24 set, but I highly recommend you do. Those of you who have the 12 set, I think this is more than enough, and I'll go over the 12 set in the demo as well. I like to provide this list. Again, if you run out of a color, you can go to Artists of Craftsman, Blick, any art supply store, and pick up a individual color in case if you run out. And here are the codes on the back of the container. So let's talk a little bit about selecting which profile will work best for your photographic reference, which is crucial, right? So you have a few options. Remember, we're only working with portraits. We are not working with the entire body. That's completely optional if you want to use the body. As long as we have a portrait for the sake of this assignment. Remember that, okay? Frontal, directly looking at us, like this camel here. Profile or side view, which is in this center image here from the parrot. And then 3/4, which is a more sort of classical, almost Greco-Romanesque sort of composition of the head, okay? These are all examples of students' work selecting which composition they would like to use, as well as which profile they want to arrange for their animal. From the camel to the parrot to the kangaroo, right? It all varies depending on your reference, okay? Remember, part of this process would be to understand, and again, selecting a high resolution photographic reference when researching your image online. I cannot stress enough how important that is throughout this assignment, okay? In this slide here, you'll also see these are strategies and directions of how to use and utilize the grid, which we've discussed multiple times throughout this quarter, okay? We have an image here of a giraffe from here that I just found on Google. I applied the grid directly onto the image and using our first layer, which is the apple green, created the composition, okay? Pretty self-explanatory. We've discussed this before. If you have any questions about it, I have a video link right down here for you to watch. So feel free to look at that at your own time. Now, after you apply your grid, okay, from the photographic reference, the first layer you will apply is your apple green color as your primary layer of your, okay? Part of this would be to, again, understand the color combinations of using the apple green, not only as a base, but you are not allowed to use white or black throughout this assignment, okay? I want you to create your black, which are your shadows, with color. And I want you to use color to create your whites as highlights. Talk a little bit more about this later on during the demo. Here is another example where a student sent me their reference of a bald eagle. And I was actually walking over and sort of, again, showing the instructions of how to utilize the grid, which eventually came up to something like this. So by the end of next week, you should have your grid ready to go if you want to. Again, this is completely optional if you want to utilize the system of the grid or if you want to freehand this. But in order just to map down the composition, I would highly, highly, highly recommend, again, using the system of the grid. Okay. Now, this is a sort of, again, time-lapse video, which is available under the modules tab. And this is the Jaguar that we used for the demo. I believe this was like 2 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. Now, the first layer I applied was the apple green to complete the entire composition. Second layer would be to add your darks. Okay, that's a rule of thumb that I highly recommend. Again, we all should follow. Use indigo blues and browns for your shadows and tones and shades and darks, okay? Throughout the entire drawing. You don't want to do it one at a time, right? You don't want to add one dark area and then go jump to your light. You want to gradually work your entire drawing first with your darker tones and layers, right? Then gradually work your way up to midtones and lights. Now in the third layer, we use, again, a combination of using Spanish orange, crimson red, Tuscan red, light cerulean blue, and sienna brown for the middle tones. And lastly, for the last layers, for your highlights, you want to use your peaches, your pinks, your Parma violets, your true blues, and your whites for highlights. Now you want to be very careful when you use your whites. It really kills the color that is underneath, layered from your previous layer, I should say. Part of this would be to sort of understand how much time you utilize throughout this drawing. And if I'm not mistaken, I think this drawing took me about 4 to 5 hours myself in 2 days. So 2.5 hours there, 2.5 hours there, somewhere around that time. Okay. This is something I would always, again, advise everyone to really follow. Always begin with your darker colors for your shadows, building the layers of color. Okay. Remember, because these are oil-based, you can work in layers on top of each other. So keep that in mind. Now the time lapse is a completely, the link is actually listed on the bottom that I want you to use. And again, watch during your own time. But a part of this would be to sort of understand and ask those questions about how to document and find a correct reference. You can see here on the examples, here's a sample of a great photographic reference of hyenas. I was just found on Google. And here's a really not so great photographic reference of a deer, right? Resolution, right? Picture quality of the image is crucial. Really, another aspect to consider, always remember, review those learning objectives at every lecture, would be to select how to represent the animal, right? Whether frontal, 3/4 view, or profile view of the animal. And then within that, using process of elimination, select your top 3 best images to use. Throughout today, I will go around and talk to you individually and see which images you would like to use throughout this assignment. Now, let's look at some examples. Here are some parrots, and these are all from students' work. Every single one, from different quarters, throughout different times, throughout different years, okay? Just to kind of wrap your guys' head around this assignment. Again, it's funny, I just noticed all of them are looking at one direction. That's funny. All of them are exploring different species of the bird, of the animals itself, I should say, different colors, even different sexes of the animal. And that is something you should be exploring. You could also be exploring different ages of the animal, right? Different parts of the world. Where is it from? A part of the continent or a part of the world it's from? How does it look? Or is it in a warmer climate throughout the world, in a colder climate, right? Here's kind of a selection of tigers, right? All vastly different, right? Each one of them have a sort of different style, different method, color combination. Here is a bunch of elephants, right? Are elephants only gray? Absolutely not, right? But they must represent an actual animal. Now, how you go about doing this is completely up to you. You could be expressive. You could be adding props, adding other subjects, playing with the idea of sort of realism of different realities. But the animal's portrait must be clear, right? Here is some of the families of the wolves. The wolf family, right? Again, all vastly different, dealing with multiple tonal variations, variety of colors, combinations, light sources, but also not neglecting the background, right? Here are some of the lion family, right? Again, you could use different sex of the animal, different lighting of the animal, different species of the animal, right? Old, young, male, female, have fun with this. Here's one which was really interesting of, I believe this was an albino lion that the artist chose, and she wanted to create more vibrant colors with the Prismacolor. The ape family, right? Kind of a variety of chimpanzees, of apes, of monkeys, orangutans. It's completely up to you. But you can see how diverse and how different each animal are, right? The turtle family. This was one that I think we were working on a demo, if I'm not mistaken, last week for another class of mine. that when a student wanted to research their animal, they had some confusion about which reference to use, but really honing in and focusing that the key aspects of this assignment would be a portrait, so just the face of the animal. Here are some of the owl family, right? Again, all vastly different, dealing with more vibrant colors, more natural colors in flight, the entire body, parts of the body, they all vary. Here's some of the snake family, right? Again, being very expressive, experimental, right? But also utilizing their key aspects of what? Focusing on just the portrait. Here's some of the sloth family, right? Are sloth only gray? No, right? There are pretty interesting animals, but also sort of recognizing their environments of how light changes through their actual environments, you know, casting different color variations on their fur. And that is the end